how we can improve the life, the economic perspective, cultural perspective, social perspectives of communities by doing archaeology with them. Most of you, many of the master students know that legislation in Italy is not so good, beneficial to these participatory activities, but we'll see, I think, different examples on different countries to understand what could be done and what not. Without saying anything else, I will invite Alexa. Remember, all of you have to present somebody in the next day, so look how she does it. And she's going to present our invited guest today, and then to lead, if there is any, I hope, question after the paper, she's going to lead also the discussion. Okay.
So, today we have as a guest Peter Gould. He started his career in economics. He worked in this area for many years, including his senior staff role at the President's Council of Economics Advisors. So he has many experiences in the economic area. He had an early interest in economic development, archaeology and heritage that led him to his master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania in 2010 in global studies, and then at his PhD in 2014 at the University College London in archaeology, so at the Institute of Archaeology. He is involved in many organizations and in many projects. For example, he is a partner of the Dig Ventures Ltd, that is a crowdfunded based commercial archaeology firm in the UK. And he has many personal experiences in the governance of communities project, including his role as chairman at Pennsylvania Zoo and Mann Institute of Music. He decided to focus his studies on the cultural economics and on the relationship between archaeology practice and cultural heritage management toward the economics development. He's also studying the governance of community-based projects that wants to improve the economical growth of a local community through their heritage resources. He has studied in these kinds of projects and this kind of organization in Brazil, in Peru, Ireland and Italy, from which he made his most recent publication, that is in 2018, that is empowering communities through archaeology and heritage. So in these 2 days of conferences, today and tomorrow, that are organized by our professor Alexandra Chavarria, he will talk to us about the relationship between archaeology, cultural heritage and economics, and how to develop an economical growth of local communities through these subjects. So please welcome Peter Gould.
Thank you. It's kind of scary how much you can find out about me on the internet, isn't it? I'm glad to be here. Lovely to see such a big crowd. What we're going to do in the next 2 days is introduce you to an element of public archaeology. Public archaeology is sort of outside the mainstream of archaeology, and I'm going to take you outside the mainstream of the mainstream. As Alexa said, my background is in economics and in business, and I came to this world of archaeology relatively late in life, but I have spent 2 decades working with community organizations in the Philadelphia area, and have had a lifelong interest in economic development. So what I'm trying to bring together here for you is sort of 30 or 40 years of economics, 20 years of community work, and 10 or 15 years now of cultural heritage. What we're going to do in these 2 days, today I want to introduce you to some of the fundamental concepts in economics and how those apply in the world of cultural heritage. And tomorrow we're going to talk about the relationship of archaeology and heritage to communities, how one organizes community projects, how one can use archaeology for economic benefit, and what some of the pitfalls are if it isn't done right. So that's kind of the trajectory of the 2 days. That's right. I want to start with the perspective that economics in much of the world of archaeology and cultural heritage is to some degree a dirty word. There is in the profession what my friend Catherine LaFrance Samuels has labeled a sort of a reflexive antipathy to anything having to do with capitalism and business and that sort of thing. One of the reasons is that while we like to enjoy heritage from the perspective of a pristine site monument, in this case the Trevi Fountain, what lots of heritage specialists see are the Roman helmets, the Pope Francis bobblehead dolls, and the sort of thing that debases and from our sort of perspective in the field, undermines the integrity and value of what we regard as a very important legacy of humanity. So archaeologists tend not to like the business side of what we're doing. I want to explain to you today why that is not the way we should think about economics and business. Now, what's the point of economics? And I want to spend a few minutes just talking about what the point of this is and why it matters to you. Economists are focused on scarce resources. If something is super abundant, if there's enough of it for everybody, economists, generally speaking, don't care about it. If there's not enough, you suddenly have a major problem in life. That is, how much of it should you make? Who should get it? How are you going to distribute it? How are you going to make the outcome fair? The problem of the creation of economic products, we'll get to what those are in a minute, and their production and distribution and allocation is a fundamental issue that exists whether you're talking about the construction of an Apple computer or how do you decide among cultural sites, all of which may need protection, but we're not able to protect them. So the first thing that economists care about is scarcity. And then once they decided we have something scarce, they have a series of sort of core concerns. One is whatever we're going to do effective. If we have a policy to protect a site, if we want to do something in regard to a piece of cultural heritage, does it work? Does it achieve the goals that are laid out for it? I have argued in other places one of the things public archaeology isn't very good at is articulating its goals and measuring whether it does it well. But economists worry about this all the time. The next thing what they want to know is it efficient? If we have something that works, do we do it with the least cost, the least amount of resources used that is possible? Or is there a cheaper, better way to achieve our goal? So is it effective? Does it work? Is it efficient? Is the cost as low as it can be? Who pays for it? The question of incidence is a very important issue in society. If we are subsidizing cultural activities, if the government is subsidizing activities, somebody is paying for that, generally speaking, taxpayers, and somebody is consuming it, may not be taxpayers, may not be the same taxpayers. So who pays and who benefits become a very important economic question. And then there's really a political question that underlies that economic question, which is the answer to who pays and who benefits fair? So, and fair is a political judgment, not an economic judgment, but it's important to how you structure policies, particularly in an area like ours. So 5 points in economics. Is the resource scarce? Do we have policies that are effective? Is what we're doing efficient? What's the incidence of whatever we're doing, and is it equitable? Now, what makes all this relevant is that the real scarce resource today in cultural heritage is money. Around the world, attitudes towards spending on things like cultural heritage are changing very rapidly. Governments have been in austerity mode for various reasons, some of them political, like in Britain and in the United States, some of them economic, like in Italy, where for one reason or another governments have said, we just can't spend as much as we used to. We don't want to spend as much as we have been spending. So immediately there's now more demand for money than there is money. And we're faced with the question of who should get the money and how. That partly reflects shifting views of what government should do. I think historically in much of Europe, the view was the government should take care of things like cultural heritage. That view is shifting. It's taking into account more private sector activity, whether it's philanthropy or private company subsidies, like Todd's subsidy for the repair of the Colosseum, or taking into account partnerships between public and private entities. We'll talk a bit about those, but the point is that these attitudes towards who should play what role imply that not only is government making decisions about which resources should be funded where, and should it go to heritage, or should it go to social services, or should it go to tax reductions, but those private entities that are getting involved have to make decisions about how much money they want to devote to heritage as opposed to something else. Finally, particularly in the United States, to a lesser degree in Britain, and sort of in its earliest stages in Italy, there's this question of philanthropy. That is, are people who have lots of money prepared to give it away to support some activity? In the United States, that's the way we fund most social programs, particularly things in the cultural arena. It's done with money that's donated. Britain does a substantial amount of that and has been actively pushing their museum sector in that direction. Italy has had some very interesting experiences, like Todd's subsidy, paying for the conservation of the Colosseum and the huge public uproar that came around that. The uproar around Fendi's redoing the Mussolini building in EUR, and so on the one hand, you've had some very public consternation about what role the private sector should play in heritage, but at the same time, you have increasing numbers of private museums, foundations that are supporting the arts, things like that, all over the country. And so Italy itself is migrating, and now we're beginning to see in the attempts to reform places like Herculaneum and Pompeii and the national museums, a change in policy here that's beginning. It's a first step toward at least where Britain has headed, if not where the United States is headed. So there are lots of actors involved today in cultural heritage, even in a country like Italy, which was historically so government-dominated, all of whom have different interests and different concerns about where money should go in heritage and who should pay for it. So money becomes the thing that binds this whole conversation together in the archaeology world. The question is, why should you care? You all want to study archaeology and history and stuff like that. The answer is you're going to end up either working for the government in this changing context I just described, or you're going to end up perhaps working in a university doing archaeological research, or you're going to end up working for a commercial archaeology business, which is the primary employer of archaeologists in much of the world. In all of those places, these decisions about money are going to be made every day. And they're not going to be made by people who are thinking about what's in the ground. They're going to be made by people who are thinking about money. They're going to be made by business people and people who think like economists, even if they're archaeologists or historians. So if you're going to be in those places, The reason we're starting to teach this kind of stuff is you really need to at least understand the thought process and the language and a bit of the theory, so that if you're in a meeting where somebody's trying to make an economic decision about something that affects what you're doing, you're able to track it and participate in it and not just have it blow past you. Because you cannot avoid being in economic conversations in archaeology in the future anywhere in the world. That's why we're doing this. Now, what I want to do today is walk you through some of the fundamentals of economics to make sure you can speak to how economics works, how the theory works, what the core issues are, particularly as they affect cultural heritage, and then talk a bit about the role of cultural heritage in the economy from various perspectives, some of which we'll pick up in more detail tomorrow. So we're going to talk about just what is an economy, how do economies manage this problem of scarcity. We're going to talk about markets, what they are, how they work. Then we're going to talk about market failure, which is a core concept in cultural heritage, because most of what we deal with in our world are activities and for which markets do not exist and for which markets do not work. We're going to talk about the role of government. We're going to talk about how decisions are made. And we're going to talk about a core problem in archaeology and heritage going into the future, which is trying to figure out what the value of archaeology is. How do we measure the benefits of what we're doing so we can help make decisions right? And then we're going to look at heritage in various guises in the economy. So, first question, what's an economy? This is a picture of the Asociación Quillasta in Raqui, Peru. It is a community project of the residents of this village, which was one of the places I lived for a long time, studied for my PhD. We will get into more detail about it tomorrow, but what I want you to see is how something as small as a table full of essentially tourist tchotchke in the middle of Peru can help you think about what an economy is. The first thing, the definition of an economy, again, it's all in the notes, so please do look at this. The definition of an economy is, quote, a system of activity connected with the production, trade, and consumption of goods and services in a region, a country, or another not geographic area. So goods are the tchotchke on the table. Goods are physical things. Services are anything else that is transacted in economic life that are not tangible. So the service here is the retail activity. When you go into a shop, you are buying a good from a service establishment. If you buy an insurance policy, you're not actually buying a thing, you're buying a service. You're buying a commitment that if you break your leg, the insurance company will pay for getting it fixed. Or if you smash up your car, it will pay to get the car fixed. Services are ubiquitous. It's the largest activity in the economy in the world. The largest sector of the service economy is the tourism sector, and the most important driver of the tourism sector is cultural heritage. So one of the direct linkages between this slide and tomorrow's lecture is that cultural heritage is the driver of the largest service sector in the world economy. First thing. But what you see here is a small activity in a small village in the economy of Raqui, Peru. Raqui has its own economy. But Raqi's economy is part of the Peruvian economy, a larger geographic area in the definition. And this activity is part of the tourist economy. which is a global phenomenon. Doesn't just cover one geography or another. So economies can be very narrow in concept, they can be very broad, and you always have to be careful when you are thinking about the role of something in an economy to be clear to yourself, well, what economy am I talking about? But the core issue is whenever you have an economy, what's really going on is an exchange of usually money, sometimes it's a barter, for goods and services. And there are lots of decisions that have to be made in this process. The first decision is, what are we going to make, right? Who decides what to make? Second question is, how much of it should we make? The third question is, how should we physically distribute it or offer a service to people? If you think about the problem of designing and building an Apple computer and then getting all the parts assembled from all over the world, put together and then into a store and then into your hands, you can begin to get a sense of how many decisions have to be made to produce a thing. If you think about a tourist coming to Rome, think about all the things you have to do to get from Dubuque, Iowa to Rome and home and have a good experience. How do those decisions get made? Well, in the global sense, you can think of two broad models. There's what are called command economies, which was the old Soviet model, was the old Chinese model. Other than the North Koreans, not many people do this anymore, but it illustrates the extreme at one end of the conversation, which is the government decides. In the old days in the Soviet Union, there was a thing called Das Plan, and Das Plan was this big, giant econometric model that decided how much of everything needed to be made in order to have a perfectly balanced economy. And then they would issue quotas to factories that said you should make so many notebooks, you should make so many pens, you should make so many computers. As we all know, it didn't work very well. But that's one end of the spectrum. The other end is a pure market economy, where the market figures out, through what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, how much should be made and how much should not, and who should get it and how it's distributed. So markets are often in our world a dirty word. Well, I don't want to get the market in the middle of this. But let's think about what markets are capable of doing when they work right. The idea behind a market is in some sense very simple. First, the assumption is that you as a consumer know what you want. And you as a consumer, when you go into the marketplace, whether it's to buy a shirt or to buy a car or to take a trip to the beach or a trip to Rome to see a site, you know what you want. And in the conventional models, the assumption is you are doing what you were doing in order to maximize what economists call your utility. If you were all at University College London, I would tell you all about how Jeremy Bentham, who founded University College London, invented this concept. That's because Jeremy Bentham sits in University College London in a box. When he died, he has to be stuffed and mounted and kept on display. So it's great fun at UCL to talk about utilitarians because the founder of it is actually around the corner in a box. The idea of utility in economics is simply that you are motivated by essentially a personal hedonistic desire to make yourself as happy as you can. In theory, that's what drives your behavior. On the other side, in the theory, the supplier of whatever you're consuming, the notebook, the pen, the shirt, the car, the archaeological site, is driven to maximize profit. All that a business person should care about in the economic model is maximizing profit. And then what happens when this hedonistic, utility maximizing consumer meets this greedy, profit maximizing business person is in the market, they are A, making individual decisions about what they want to buy. B, there are lots of people out there trying to satisfy you as a consumer, and you as a consumer, and you as a consumer. And that competition does two things. One, it forces suppliers, companies, to produce what you want. So, you know, if Francesca's buying a blue dress, and there are no blue dresses on offer, but she goes in and says, I want a blue dress, well, somebody may make a blue dress. On the other hand, if they're selling lots of green striped dresses with purple flowers on them and nobody's buying them, they're going to stop making them. So the whole underlying concept in economics is that consumers are the sovereign. You, the consumer, are the one who decides what is made and how much it costs. Because if it costs too much, you're not going to buy it, and people will stop making it. If it's very inexpensive, it may not be very profitable, and so companies may stop making it until the price goes up. Competition among companies will drive the most efficient solution to satisfy what you as a consumer want. So the whole theory of economics says that what markets do is they bring together multiple sellers, and it might be, you know, in an outdoor market, like the one around the corner that we walked through a few minutes ago, where there's lots of people selling oranges, and you're going to go around and figure out which orange is the best and which one's the cheapest, you know, or which orange seller is a family friend, and you're going to buy it from them because that makes you happy and make him happy. Or it might be a big department store, where there are going to be 15 different brands of coffee on the shelf, and you're going to go in and decide which one you want and which ones you don't. And the ones you all collectively don't want go away eventually. Or it can even be something that's logical, like the stock exchange. It's not really, this is all happens these days on computers, right? You know, stocks and bonds get traded among buyers and sellers in an electronic marketplace that doesn't really tangibly exist. This is just an artifact of it. Any of those things are markets. All of them are driven by the idea that the buyer in the market is the one who is the important player. Now, in order for this to work, what's important is that there be signals between the buyer and the seller that are understandable, that explain what each should do. The first idea here is that individuals respond to incentives. An incentive is anything that motivates your behavior. Incentives can be tangible. They can be psychological. You can buy from the fruit vendor who's the family friend. They can be financial. I can pay you to do something. But whatever the reason is that we're motivating you to do something, an incentive is at the core of how people behave. And one of the things economists believe fundamentally is that as people respond to incentives, companies respond to incentives, bureaucrats respond to incentives. Incentives may not be financial. There's a large body of study in economics around the behavior of bureaucracies, which could be boiled down to sometimes it's not how much you get paid, because you kind of max out how much you get paid. It's about power. Right? Power can be a big incentive. So economists would look at a power struggle in a bureaucracy over who got control of how much of the superintendenza, and they would see that as a battle for, you know, being driven by the incentive in the bureaucracy, which is to have power over as much as you can have. The issue with respect to markets is that you're looking for a simple way to communicate a very complex set of ideas between consumers and producers. And it turns out the simplest way to communicate that and create incentives is the price. Just think about what a price really is. If your iPhone costs, I don't know if it once cost 1,000 euros or something like that these days, what's embedded in that 1,000 euros is actually a phenomenal amount of information. What's embedded in that from the producer's side is I know how much it costs. All the cost to put this thing together, I've got them all bundled up and it's all built into my cost structure. I have embedded in my price the profit I want to make. And I've got embedded in my price, if I'm Apple, some notion of how much you're willing to overpay for an iPhone. Either because you think they're cool to have, or like my wife, you discovered you're locked into their messenger channel and it's so hard to get out and you give up and keep buying iPhones. So they've got a whole bunch of interesting ideas baked into how they price this. You as a consumer coming to it saying, I want a certain size, I want a certain weight, I want it to have certain functions, use certain apps, I want it to look nice, I don't want it to break, I've got a whole bunch of criteria, which if you went to market and what you said was, here's my list of criteria for a phone, and the supplier said, well, here's my cost build up and all this kind of stuff, you wouldn't really know how to sort it out. But if the answer is $1,200, if you like it and it's got what you need, you pay $1,200. If it doesn't, you don't. So think of all the interesting information that's embedded in the price and all the things you can understand or you don't have to understand if you set the price, if you let the market set the price. So the virtue of markets is they're incredible communications devices. Now, prices, therefore, serve as incentives to suggest that, okay, do I want to go to the Coliseum today? It's going to cost me $20 or whatever the combo ticket is. Is it worth that? Or would I rather go out to a big lunch and spend $20 there? The $20 is my sort of symbolic holder of all the value I have for what I want to do today, and how I spend that $20 is my action in the market of activities to do today at Rome. That is at the core of how resources get allocated between, if you will, in that example, heritage sites and restaurants. So the market has this incredible capacity to make lots of decisions, decide who gets what, how much is produced, how it's distributed. Are you going to buy stuff from a discount store? Are you going to buy the same thing from a high-price store? All those decisions get made without anybody talking to anybody because all of the information is packed into a price. You're motivated by incentives, and you're making your decisions based on whether that price is consistent with the amount of your utility you're getting from consuming the good. Now, where does this have to do with heritage? Well, let me give you a concrete adverse example. There's a concept in economics called elasticity. That is, how much do people's behavior change, or any kind of behavior change, if there's a change in something else. Technically, it's the percentage change in one thing over the percentage change in another. The one that's most relevant most of the time is the elasticity of demand. How much does price change? Does a price change lead to a change in demand? How much does demand change when you change price? Often, when you first think about, well, how much should we charge to go to the Coliseum, or go to a museum, or buy an iPhone? There's not a lot of thought given to, well, what else can people do with their money? And how much are they likely to want to spend on us? What's the value of what I'm offering compared to the other alternatives they have? At the zoo last year, Philadelphia Zoo, where I was chairman for a long time, the entry price for general admission is, it was around $22.50. the marketing team decided they could raise the price to $25. Not a big jump. 10%, 5%. It wasn't a big jump. The consequence was this, 10% increase in price led to something on the order of a 20% drop in attendance. We hit the point where the visitor said, you know what, it's just not worth it to me. I have better things to do with my money. And so the sovereign consumer said, I'm going to go somewhere else and do something else. In that case, there's another zoo in the region, and some of them went to the other zoo. Some of them went to other museums. Some of them just went to the park and bought a more expensive picnic. But either way, where the price point was set had a huge economic impact on the institution. So as you get into circumstances, for example, where what they're wrestling with in Britain these days is they're trying to privatize as much of the cultural heritage sector as they can. This is going to drive decisions about how much should we charge for a membership in English Heritage, how much should we charge for admission to a stately home in England. Those decisions, if not thought through carefully in the context of the entire market that is involved and what's motivating people to go to the stately home or join English Heritage as opposed to doing anything else with their money, can lead to really perverse outcomes. So understanding that there are sort of, if you will, ripple effects from economic decisions you have to take into account. Even in the heritage sector, you have to worry about your competition. How many museums are there in Rome? If one of them starts charging, are they going to lose business or are they going to gain business? What else can people do with their time? If you're in the government and you're making a decision about, how are we going to fund the programs in our community, if you charge for them, you may not get the attendance you want. If you don't charge for them, you have to subsidize them more, and that's going to take money away from other activities in the community. So these economic decisions that the market solves very easily may not be as easily solved in our world. The reason is the market idea works under a set of very strict assumptions. People have to know a lot about what they want. The market has to be pretty free and fair. There's got to be a decent amount of competition and that sort of thing. The problem in cultural heritage, in particular, is what's known in economics as market failure. Market failure has three different elements that all boil down to the same thing. The market is not going to deliver you the right answer as to how much to make, how to price it, and that sort of thing. What the market failure has three components, notion. One, what are called externalities. One of the theories about the price as a great piece of information is that it contains all the information you really need to make a rational decision. However, if there are either external costs that haven't been included in the price, or external benefits that somehow haven't been captured, you're going to misevaluate the good you're looking at. So in the days before we had regulation of any kinds of emissions, everything that was made in the manufacturing plant was arguably underpriced because society was bearing the cost of the air pollution, the dirty buildings, the sick people. All that kind of stuff that happened from pollution was an externality to the businesses that were causing it. So the government stepped in and regulated them to try to push those costs back in. Because you got to put a scrubber on, and that's going to raise your costs, which should raise your price, and now people know what it really costs to produce it. Things like museums, archaeological sites, things like that, have many functions in society. But they are not well articulated from a market point of view.
Can I ask you something?
Yep.
How much does publicity, branding, appeal invest in the economic price of things? I mean, something can be not so...
Branding is arguably, viewed from this perspective, branding is one of the things you're consuming. It's part of what drives you to buy, you know, a Fendi bag, right? Because it's got Fendi on it, and you get some psychological value out of being able to walk around with a Fendi bag, and that is maximizing your utility, your personal happiness, because you're carrying a bag around. Going to a World Heritage Site lets you, for those who have heritage site bucket lists, check off the bucket list, but at least you can, when you go home and say, I went to Rome, if you say you went to a bunch of places nobody ever heard of, and you haven't been to the branded places, the World Heritage Site places, we feel kind of silly. So the value of the World Heritage brand is, in some sense, it's signaling to people, this is important, you should come see this. There's not a big literature on the question of whether the World Heritage Site's label is worth it, but there is a literature, and it's a complicated literature, where the answer is somewhat ambiguous as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But branding is just, it's one of those elements of your decision, your utility maximizing decision.
But it also affects the price, because some people go to a place and say, even if it's very expensive, I cannot go home without seeing it. Because their desire to maximize their happiness is they have to go home with that. Okay? I have to go home seeing the Colosseum because I look like an idiot if I went to Rome and never went to the Colosseum. That happens. So, one problem here is, particularly in the cultural heritage area, that gets in the way of markets doing their allocated function, is that there are lots of externalities to what we do. Museums teach people things. We're not quite sure what. Museums provide social experiences. We're not always quite sure what. We're not even sure in what we do exactly what it is we're selling sometimes. I'll give you an example again from the zoo. We did a study years ago about why grandparent tickets sold so well. Grandparent passes. Grandfather and grandchild could come. So we went out and asked why. Why are these things selling so well? Well, it turns out the grandparents didn't care about the zoo. They weren't even sure they cared about whether they went to a zoo. What they discovered was the zoo was the one place they could take their grandchild, where the kid would not keep looking at his iPhone or his iPad and would have a conversation with grandpa. So what we were selling at the zoo was conversation time with grandpa. It's coincidental there were animals there. If there had been something else that worked, they would have done that too. They just wanted somewhere they could talk to their kid, their grandkid, and not have the kid drift off into a video game. So this is all, these kinds of, that's, I would argue that's, you know, in some sense it got embedded in demand, but nobody understood it. And if you go out and say, what's the educational value of a museum? Everybody here would probably say museums have educational value. We'll get to this in a bit, but what is it? How do we quantify it? It's not obviously countably embeddable in the price of entry to a museum or in the justification for a subsidy. This is becoming a huge issue everywhere because both philanthropists and governments are beginning to ask, why are we doing this stuff? What's the impact? We're going to come back to it. There's a very interesting study done a couple of years ago called Cultural Heritage Counts for Europe, which was a direct response to the European Commission's insistence on people beginning to answer the question, what's the value of what you're doing, which is an attempt to capture the externalities and bring them down to a point where we can understand. We'll come back to that. The other kind of market failure is market power. Pure and simple, if you have an organization, an entity that has
excessive clout in the market, you're not going to get competition. That has been well recognized since Marx, and characteristic of capitalism, that it tends towards monopolies. I have three what I regard as near monopolies up there in the wall: Google, Facebook, and Apple. If you're trapped in the Apple ecosystem, you can't get out. They can charge so much money because it's so hard to move your software, and move your photos, and move your iPhone and all that stuff. So they're extracting what's called a monopoly profit because you basically can't compete with them very easily if you're trapped in the system. The third and the issue with market power is simply that competition doesn't work. There isn't fair competition. The result is prices are too high, supply is lower than it would otherwise be, and you may not get the other industries, not technology, the degrees of innovation and downward pressure on cost that you would get from a more competitive market. So the Android market, which is more open, has much more competition, much lower prices, many more product offerings than the Apple market, which is essentially a quasi-monopoly. The Superintendenza is arguably a quasi-monopoly. All of the non-profit museums in the United States are arguably a more competitive market when they're facing one another in the same town. The third category of market failure is a public good. A public good can be seen as a good, a thing that is something that we all would use and for which I have no ability to prevent you from using it at the same time I do, nor does your use of it interfere with my use. The classic example of a public good was national defense. Adam Smith talked about this. One of the characteristics of public goods is some people don't like to pay for them. They're called free riders. So you have to force people to pay for an army because they all benefit from the army. You need the army. It's going to defend the whole country. I can't stop you from being defended. You can't stop me from being defended. My defense doesn't subtract from your defense, but I need to be forced to pay for it because on my, happiness register, it's not going to be at the top of the list, even though I know I need it. This is a problem they call under-provision of public goods. The other problem with public goods, which manifests itself in classically in what's known as the tragedy of the commons, is that commonly held goods, if everybody is out maximizing their own benefit, will tend to be overconsumed, even destroyed. So think about heritage sites like Machu Picchu, for example, which can be overrun by tourists, because there's no real way to stop them from going out there for any, other than the numbers of seats on the train. If they can get to Agua Caliente and get up the hill, they can go there, and they're happy to collect the money, but there may be thousands and thousands of people in there at any one time, which at least is degrading the experience. I don't know, any of you ever been to Machu Picchu? Well, I've been there at 8 o'clock in the morning until noon, and around 10 o'clock is when the trains come in. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the place is absolutely pristine. It looks like all the pictures. It's an amazingly beautiful place. By 10 o'clock, when 7,000 people have come through the gate, they're all crowding on the narrow pathways and stomping on the stones and sitting on the walls and things like that. Your sort of archaeologist's heart goes, right. And both the experience is damaged and arguably the physical fabric is damaged. So this problem of public goods and how do you manage them becomes critical. The historic answer very much has been, we'll let the government do it. So you have this problem. If we have lots of aspects of what we do that don't fit the standard market model, because they have externalities like museums or because they're public goods, what are we going to do about it? in much of the world, not the United States. The answer historically was the government's going to take care of these things. So the government regulates what's done with old buildings, the government regulates what's done with archaeological sites, the government regulates how art is managed and conserved, the government owns and operates the museums, the government owns and operates the sites, owns and operates the stately homes in England for English heritage for years. This was the way that much of the world did it. The United States model has always been very different. And that goes back, if you read de Tocqueville, it goes back to the founding of the country. You know, something to do with the history of the frontier, people being so far away from the government that if they didn't work together, nobody would do it. And none of them liked the government anyway, so they didn't want any government. So you have a country that is just chock full of volunteers who give their time and give their money to accomplish a particular task, because that's just how we do it. So, you know, the museums, the U.S. government owns and operates the Smithsonian museums in Washington, and that's it. It owns through the National Park Service and operates some of the major historical monuments, Independence Hall, and things like that. Some of the others are owned by states, but much of the heritage in the United States is actually managed either in private hands or, if it's really important, predominantly through nonprofit organizations. So you have a real distribution of possible models. The problem with the government model, as I said at the outset, is governments are starting to not want to pay for this. They have too many demands on their budgets. They have too many needs to be fulfilled. There are too many people who need health care, too many people who need housing, too many people who need food, too many people who need education. And somehow this problem of what do you do about heritage, what do you do about culture, is becoming a real thorn in the side of governments. So the British are as aggressively as they can getting it out of the budget. They're shutting down museums, they're cutting funding, they're privatizing activities as fast as they can to begin to look more like the United States. The problem with our model is you don't have the levels of philanthropy anywhere else in the world that you have in the United States by many orders of magnitude, and it's not likely to happen very fast. So there's a world, and then in the middle you have ideas like public-private partnerships. We're gonna work with the private sector to run our museums, or work with the private sector to operate our parks. This is an area in which there's lots of interest because it feels like the government is doing its job but not actually requiring spending money. Operationally, they've had lots of issues. There is a large literature also on the failure of public-private partnerships. Britain has gone through some very difficult times. But this search, there's a search going on right now for how do we pay for and support cultural heritage and cultural-related activities in a world where money is scarce. And the role of government is changing more or less in real time. Now, any way you look at it, when you are sitting in the government, the issue is you have to make decisions. You've got to decide what you're going to spend your money on. And the way economists think about that, most simply, is they want to know, back to our point about effectiveness and efficiency, one, are the benefits of whatever you're going to do greater than the cost to do it? If I'm a businessman and I'm making a computer, if it costs me $1,000 to make it and I can't sell it for more than $900, I'm not going to do it anymore because the costs exceed the revenue. If I am looking at a social program, one of my favorites on the board of an opera school, Should we subsidize opera? How many of you here go to opera? Wow, really? Woo! That's the problem. You know, opera is arguably a dying art. There are lots of people who think that, you know, well, we have to preserve classical music. It's been around for 200 years. It's what people do. But you know what? There's an awful lot of people who don't care. Now, where should the government put its money? Well, it should try to figure out where the benefits for society exceed the cost. You know, and so we'll come back to that in the next slide. But this question of what's the value of a cultural activity is at the core. The general principle is I'm not going to do anything that has a greater cost than it does a benefit. You can think about it in two ways. One is you can just look at some kind of indicators. If I want to compare two government programs in education, I want to do the one that is going to, A, have benefits that I believe are acceptable for the cost, if I can't put dollar signs on it. But I want to do the one that has the most benefits. If I want to get more kids graduated from college, I want to have the program that gets the most kids out per dollar I spend on getting them out. Maybe that means I subsidize universities. In the US, it's tended to mean they want to subsidize distance learning. They're always trying to find the lowest cost way to achieve an objective. Ideally, you'd like to think about it with dollars and cents. I'd like to be able to literally look at the ratio of the dollars of benefit and value to the dollars of cost. That turns out to be, in our world, exceedingly difficult. Because the externalities are hard to quantify and define. The output, the product. What is the product of an archaeological study? What does it do? What is it that has value that you can quantify and compare to its cost? There is no good answer to that question. There are some techniques we'll talk about. But the issue is that if you are an economist, if you are a decision maker in the government, if you are a decision maker in a university and you're saying, you know, which department, you know, am I going to keep open and which one am I not? You're trying to figure out in some sense, notionally or financially, which one is the most valuable to me. Which one has the most students? Do I shoot archaeology or do I shoot biology? Well, I got more students in biology, that's more tuition money. You know, on the other hand, archaeology is not very expensive and biology needs labs, so, you know, but if I'm net ahead in biology, I'll keep biology and shoot archaeology. Those kinds of decisions get made every day in those institutions that allocate the money to activities like this. English Heritage, as they have spun themselves off into private sector kinds of activities, is dealing in real time with what buildings should we keep open for how long and when. The English government has been cutting subsidies to local museums for the last 10 years. A friend of mine's been working on a study trying to do a census of museums in Britain, and they've concluded that over the last 6 or 8 years, there's been a net loss of about 10% of the museums in Britain due to price cuts. Those are due to government subsidy cuts. So decisions have to be made about what to do, and the way those decisions get made, if you're in business, if you're in government, if you're in anything having to do with operations with this, is looking at the benefits and comparing it to the costs. And the problem we have is we can do a great job at cost. Any of you with a little bit of time could tell me the cost to run the Coliseum, the cost to run a museum, the cost to run we know what it costs. But what's the benefit? What's the value of these places? I just put these up just to illustrate some of the complications. The economists have identified a range of different types of value that are appropriate in the cultural world. Break that into two buckets: instrumental values and intrinsic values. Instrumental values, first of them is use value. What's the use value of a building? It's basically what you can rent it for. Can I use this building in today's world in some fashion? There is an option value. The option value is how much would you be willing to pay in order to have the option to do something in the future. I really want to go to Italy. I haven't done it yet, but I'm willing to pay something to make sure Italy doesn't disappear. There's an existence value. The concept of an existence value is I may never get there, but I'm still willing to pay something to know that it exists. The most interesting test of the existence value theory in our recent times is the Bamiyan Buddhas. When the Taliban threatened to blow them up, they approached the UN and said, if you pay us enough money, we won't blow them up. We're testing the existence value to the world of Bamiyan Buddha. As it happened, there was no one in the UN who had anything like the amount of money they wanted, so they blew them up. But that was strictly a test of how much would you all be willing to pay as human beings to know the Bamiyan Buddha stories. So that's the concept of existence value. There is something called a bequest value. How much would you be willing to pay to have something exist for your offspring or future generations, even if you're never going to get there yourself? And instrumental values can include externalities that you can count. The educational value of museums, the family, the social cohesion that comes from museums, nationalism, patriotism that may come from preserving important historical sites. All these kind of things are arguably beneficial values which could go into this benefit cost calculus if we could figure out how to measure it. Then there's a whole class of values that economists have identified called intrinsic values. These are really tough. This is the aesthetic value of something. You know, the Kora Church in Istanbul, fabulous mosaics, beautiful place, aesthetically valuable. Spiritual value, you know, churches, Ayers Rock, Uluru in Australia, right? For the indigenous population in Australia, it's a fundamental spiritual place. It also has a use value to tourists. They like to go out and climb. Create some tension. It's a value clash, right? Between the Aboriginals who say, no, that's our sacred place, and the rock climbers who say that's our sacred rock climbing target. Well, in Australia, the Aboriginals won, and this year they banned climbing Uluru, banned climbing Ayers Rock. It took a long time. But you've got different values in there, none of which are really entirely measurable, some of which are not measurable at all. Social value, historic value, symbolic value, authenticity value. David Throsby, who's a leading cultural economist, calls all of these cultural values. They're intrinsic to the things. They matter to societies. They're all relative. It all depends on who you are and where you are and what your context is as to what's valuable to you and what's not on this scale.
But there's people who say they have also health value.
Who's that?
And there's a new, theory which says after visiting a museum or visiting a historic site or archaeological site, your health gets slightly better.
No, absolutely. The Japanese have done studies on visits to parks and to zoos. I ran a commission in Mexico Zoo. And there absolutely are externalities that are completely counterintuitive in the present day context, like people appear to be happier and healthier after they have done something outdoors.
Not only. I think it's Norway, I don't remember exactly, that doctors are starting to tell people, as, I don't know, depression thing and so on, to go to museums, because they have discovered that it has also health. Wow.
So one of the areas of research in this whole field is to try to capture evidence of this in a scientifically credible way, because there is a view that these health externalities are in fact important, and as are the educational externalities, as are the cultural externalities, etc. These are all values of cultural and archaeological and heritage activities. The problem is they're not easily quantified. The economists have some techniques. We do things called willingness to pay studies, where we will go out. There are basically two categories of things you can do. You can do what's called a revealed preference study, and you can do what's called a stated preference study. A stated preference study is where I go out and ask you what something's worth to you. So contingent valuation studies lay out scenarios that describe a situation and then try to ask you how much would you be willing to pay for this to happen, that's willingness to pay, or for it not to happen, that's willingness to avoid. And there's a whole set of rules that have been set up by the economists about how to do these kind of studies properly, but it's a way to extract from people what amounts to a demand curve. How much museum are you willing to pay for if it has this benefit? How much conservation of these buildings are you willing to pay for if it looks like this afterwards, etc. And those kinds of studies get done, not a lot, but they do get done. There's a lot of Italian cultural economists who work in this area. The other type of study is what's called a revealed preference study, where I don't ask you what you want, because people are notoriously either don't know or lie or whatever. I mean, asking people what they want is not always considered a gold standard for finding out what they want. So there are studies, for example, travel cost studies. The best estimate of what a trip to New York City is worth for you from Italy is how much you spend on it. How much you spend on the airfare, how much you spend on the hotel, how much you spend on the restaurants, how much you spend on everything else. And so there are studies done that try to accumulate how much people spend when they go from one place to another and try to project from that the value of the place. I teach a study that was done of 3 Civil War battlefields that looked at the travel cost of all the people who went to the battlefields and compared it to the operating cost of the battlefields. And they projected the visitors they interviewed out to the entire visitor population and came up with a value for each battlefield that said it's worth more than it costs, and one that wasn't. Which would then take you immediately to the question, should I shut down the other battlefield and turn it into a parking lot? But that kind of technique exists. It has a lot of problems. All of these techniques have enormous numbers of technical problems. The most obvious one is if you're measuring how much something is worth based on their travel, the site next door is worth a whole lot than the site across the country. A whole lot less than the site across the country. So nearby places get undervalued. Free places get undervalued. A museum that costs you $25 to get in is worth more on this technique than one that's free. So there's a ton of technical problems that economists haven't really sorted out as to how to value it, but they're grappling with this issue of, is there any way to capture in some fashion both the intrinsic and the instrumental values in a way that I can make the case that it's worth doing what I want to do. So if you go look at cultural heritage counts for Europe, for example, they have looked at job creation, they have looked at macroeconomic studies, there are techniques that are basically relevant to Russia's Gosplan for trying to figure out the impact on a local economy of spending on a project. I'm going to build a new museum. It's going to inject this much money into the economy. That's going to spin off so many new jobs and so much more GDP and so much more taxes. And so that benefit exceeds the cost, and therefore it's a good thing to do. Another technique with lots of holes, but they get used all the time. Always what the economists are doing is they're trying to solve this problem of what's the value of activities that have no market. The market's failed. There's no clean market, competitive market for museums or archaeological sites. And I have to make choices because money is scarce, and I have to decide what I'm going to do and what I'm not. And I need a benefit to compare to the cost. So this process of recognizing the market has value, it just doesn't always work. Where the market works, it can tell you lots. Prices can give you great information. Where it doesn't work, you now have this problem in today's world of scarce resources, government cutbacks, changing attitudes, that something has to be done. So what I want to do is, maybe I'll stop there for a minute before I go into examples of how this works in the world and see how much I've confused you all.
I ask if there's any
questions.
Professor Gould talked a couple of times about a report, which you can find on the internet. It's very easy to find.
Yeah.
Cultural heritage counts for Europe. If you look at this in the internet, you will find the PDF very quickly. And it's a really interesting thing to see how this project evaluated the value that cultural heritage can be given in Europe, which is one of the problems that we really generally have.
Right.
Why do I have to give you money for this? How much impact will this have on our society?
See, this word impact, we're going to come back to this. The word impact is not only resonating all through the halls of government. Tell me how much of a difference you make. Tell me how you're going to improve society. Tell me how you are more important than public housing. And that issue is there. The other thing that's happening is philanthropy is beginning, and this is particularly true in the United States, but it's going to spread. Philanthropy is asking the question, where can I have the most bang for the buck? If I want to fix the world, and this is these billionaires who are, doling it out, in $100, $200, and $300 million chunks, are saying, I've got a lot of money, I can make a big difference in the world. Why do I want to put it into a museum wing if I can put it into solving some disease? There's a whole ethical school that's cropped up around this. Called effective, coming in a minute, altruism, effective altruism, but the issue of impact, prove to me that the impact of what you're doing is the most efficient way to get to the goal I want, has the most bang for the buck, is really critical to how philanthropists think, and what this study is all about is it's all about how governments think. So it's all about economics driving heritage decisions. And
impact doesn't always have to be economic. It can be also on health, on culture, on democracy, on education, on everything practically. But maybe in Italy it's not so neat now, but I know, for example, in the UK and also in Spain, for example, each time you ask for a project or you make an asking for funding or anything, the most important thing that you have to feel is, how is this research going to have an impact in present and let's say tomorrow's future. So it's something that we have to start thinking about. And it's not economically only, which can also be very important, but also in other things. I wanted to make you a question.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about the governments and how governments are thinking about how much value or how much this costs and how I invest and so on. You're talking probably about Anglo-Saxon governments, because do you think, and you know a lot about the Italian government, do you think that the Italian government has any interest on evaluating these things, or is more about political and corruption and relationships and so on? I mean, do you think when they give money, they are thinking about this?
You know, my answer to that would be, if you look at what they're doing with the museums, Herculaneum, Pompeii, the National Museums, you know, there are these attempts to find another model, which not only I infer from all those attempts, there's an attempt to find a way to be more efficient, spend money more wisely, not have to spend as much, and there's a recognition that all these other problems exist, which is well known, and somehow getting it outside of a bureaucracy into a less government bureaucratized context will bring some of these elements of competition in, will make them more efficient as businesses, et cetera, et cetera. Now, are they very good at this? The track record so far says no. But, and is it universal? It's absolutely not. But, you know, even in Italy, if you will, I would argue that there's a recognition in the government that these issues have to be dealt with. In Britain, it's religion now. They're going to privatize everything they can. In the United States, it's a given. In much of the rest of Europe, people are experimenting different ways. Latin America is still reasonably centralized. Africa's feeling its way on everything. Asia, China's highly decentralized in its structure, but it's all government. So the models are varied all over the world.
And do you think there is just these two ways? Government or privatization, or there is not a third way?
I think it's a continuum where you can have various solutions. The problem is each model has serious difficulties, right? The private sector model, if the market doesn't work, it's, you know, if a museum should exist and you spin it off as a museum, as a private entity, and you don't have a philanthropic backstop, which nobody except the United States really has, then it's going to fail. And everybody's say, well, why did that museum die? Well, it died because nobody was paying for it, right? So until you have either a funding alternative or some sort of funding alternative to enable heritage organizations, cultural organizations to survive without government subsidy, then if you just spin them off and say the private market will solve it, that basically says they're going to die. And in most of the world that's true because the United States is close to unique, except for the Brits, in the volume of activity that's funded by private philanthropy. Now, the point of this first slide is I want to walk you through how some of this applies in the real world. One of the things that we have to do, apropos of this question, is you've got to learn how to run these things like businesses. That doesn't mean they're going to work as private sector activities, but when you're in the operation, when you're managing the archaeological park, when you're managing the museum, you want to be asking yourself business-like questions. If you're going to set prices of admission, you need to worry about the elasticity of demand. If you are in a situation where your costs are rising, but you're not able you don't think you're able to restructure yourself to reduce them, you have to recognize that you're eventually going to, go negative if you don't either stop the cost increase, which is often not practical because people need to be paid to live, or you don't restructure your operation so you become more productive, get more fewer people to get the job done or more good value job out of the people you've got. Businesses are very good at managing costs because they exist to make a profit. They're very good at figuring out where to set their prices so demand goes up, not down. And not-for-profit entities have a hard time at that, and government entities are terrible at it. But in the real world, if this is going to continue as a viable sector in the economy, the cultural heritage world has got to begin to think of itself as a business, and where it can, where it's appropriate, which is largely at the level of today's costs, today's revenues, things like that. It needs to run like a business and not be ashamed of that. The other thing that we need to focus on is that cultural heritage is absolutely at the core of the tourism industry, which is the biggest service industry in the world, as I said. And we shouldn't be ashamed of that either, because without the tourism industry, the most tangible reason governments support their cultural heritage is because tourists are coming to see it. There's plenty of data that says that even in places like the United States, where at least as an American it's counterintuitive because I don't think of us as having much history, phenomenal numbers of people who come to the United States do go to a museum or do go to a heritage site or do go to some kind of cultural event. So underneath the economics of the entire sector we're in is the tourism industry. And that, from the point of view of how we think about it, you have to realize tourism is a source of foreign investment for most countries in the world. It's a source of foreign exchange. When I come to Italy and start spending my dollars over here, I'm essentially providing Italy with an export, which is exporting its services to me because I'm buying them in dollars. And that is increasing your foreign exchange. It's helping your currency value, and it's creating economic activity. If you're in a country like Belize, where 1/3 of the GDP comes from tourism, Cambodia, where 28% of the people in one study who went to Cambodia only went because of Angkor Wat. You have places that are literally, the economies would collapse. And if you doubt that, you can look at what happened in Egypt after the Arab Spring, when the visitor numbers plummeted because people were afraid they'd get kidnapped or killed, and the economy really took a tremendous suck. The importance of tourism as the rationale for doing all this is critical. Lots of jobs, and many of these developing countries, lots and lots and lots of jobs are coming from the tourism industry. So we have to realize that that's all true. We also have to recognize that much urban development and much of the strategy of cities today is driven by the view of the value they can extract from their heritage. There's a concept called the creative city that's been floating around for a number of years. The basic idea is if cities are going to prosper, they have to have living in them, essentially people like you, who are young, trained, energetic, interested in being there. And the way to get those people there is to get the companies there who want to employ them. And the way you do that is you make sure the city can provide the amenities people want. That's everything from good restaurants and good housing to good museums and neighborhoods that are charming, like the one you're in. That's a place you'd like to live because it's kind of cool, and maybe you've got great bars and nightlife and things like that. All of that is part of bringing cities back to life in much of the world. And the core of that in any city that's got heritage turns out to be its stock of heritage buildings and how they can be typically deployed. So again, we're back into economic decisions. What are we going to invest in? How are we going to regulate it? How are we going to manage this stock of heritage? Is it all going to be done through government regulation, or is it going to be done through private sector activity? The same issues come up, but cities are being driven extremely rapidly and completely by this. And takes us to the philanthropic point. At the end of the day, we're not going to be able to finance this stuff and have anything sustainable until we've dealt with how do we sell all of these, how do we answer these value questions, convince the philanthropists, convince the government people that, that we have a story to tell that's worth the money. And at the same time, people have to come back, the populace has to come around to the view that it's okay to think this way. You know, I think everybody was deathly afraid that's what was going to happen to the Colosseum, right? They were just going to stick their name in the bottom and, you know, let everybody see it from the air. They certainly wanted to put their name on the back of the ticket. You know, in America, if somebody come in and said, I'll give you $25 million and I want to buy the back of your ticket for 5 years, that wouldn't even have been a hard decision. I mean, that would have been, you bet. You know, how about 50 million for 10 years? The response was very different here. That's a cultural thing. It partly stems from the fact that historically the government's done all this. But if the government doesn't want to do it and can't do it anymore, then we're going to have to think about how do we lure these folks in? How do we induce them to want to support the activities we're doing? We go to 12 or 12:30?
12 is okay.
12:15, okay. So, the moral of this story is there is a lot of value in what you can get out of economics and how you can apply it. I sent you Randy Mason's piece, right? I mean, it's still one of the best pieces ever done on this. And Mason finds 5 positives about economics. One is it's about more than markets and profit seeking. It's about how well-being is produced, distributed, and consumed. It's how these big social decisions get made. It can lead to better and more sustainable decisions, the business point. It can help build political support. People in government think the way I'm talking. If we're going to get government people to support us, we have to be able to talk to them in their language, or at least help them understand the limitations of their language and begin to see things through their eyes into our view of the world. It gives a very useful lens on preferences and how they're sorted out, because different countries have different priorities, different people have different priorities, and figuring out what should be done, you know, an economic lens is one of the lenses you can use to look at it. And he argues that it's a way, economics is a tool for ensuring the social relevance of conservation and heritage. But he does make 2 key points, which I completely agree with. One is that approaches that deal strictly with the market do a very bad job of dealing with externalities and market failure, and we are living in a sector where externalities and market failure are the norm. So you can't solve these problems just with a market answer. And the other is that markets are not really designed to answer long-term questions. The purpose of a market is to decide how much that iPhone should sell for today and get the prices and costs lined up. I don't need to pick on your iPhone. I would pick on people. We don't ask questions very often about today, except for things like what's the price of admission to the museum, or how much am I going to pay a curator, or how much should I be willing to spend on this exhibit. The core questions we ask are, how many centuries should we be preserving the Colosseum for? You know, how many decades should this conservation job of this painting last? You know, do we want to have Stonehenge around in 3000? Those are not questions markets are very good at answering. It's not even clear how you even begin to approach value-based questions. And so economics has distinct limitations when we get to a lot of the sort of core underlying issues. But in a world where money's scarce, those issues will tend to get swept aside unless we can deal with that. Now, I sent around the thing on the Yenikopi shipyard. I thought it might be a good basis for discussion if you had time to read it. This is the Yenikopi shipyard. 5 years ago, I think. And just to refresh your memory, the Turkish government is building a subway system that's going to link the Asian part and the European part and create a massively more efficient Istanbul.
All of you know what Yenikapi is? Is there somebody who doesn't know where this is and so on? Triennale, dovreste saperlo perché l'ho insegnato a lezione. Everybody knows who is Yenikapi? Can you raise your hand? Who doesn't know?
Okay. Okay, that happened. So, Yenikapi this was supposed to be the Stazione Centrale for Istanbul for their subway system, their underground. They did an archaeological survey, said good site, nothing there. The tubes up in the far right-hand corner, you can see the two tubes of the subway lines coming in. When they came in, they started to hit potsherds. When they got done, they had excavated this entire space by hand. They had uncovered Roman docks. There's one way in the back you can't really see, but it's back there. It's a marble dock. Byzantine docks. 30-some Byzantine and Roman wooden boats, more than had been found in all of history, basically. Anywhere. They found that many in one place. 88,000 cases of pots and potsherds. They held up the project for 10 years, roughly. As they were about to finish, about year 8, some archaeologists said, well, can I just go look over in this corner just for fun? And he dug for a little while and he found a Neolithic village. So they spent another 2 years excavating the Neolithic village. Erdogan was the prime minister by the time this was finished. He was rabid because this was costing the government a fortune in direct costs and indirect costs, what are called opportunity costs to economists. That is, all the people who couldn't get to work efficiently because this wasn't running were spending more money and more time that was a waste. So it raises some enormous questions like, how much archaeology is enough? When do you stop? These are questions archaeologists don't like to ask, but if you're the Prime Minister of Turkey and you've got a 10-year delay on your Grand Central Station and you're spending billions and billions of Turkish lira on collecting crates of pots that probably no one will ever look at and unearthing boats, which now that they've been unearthed have to be kept wet and then treated and then stored, and then maybe you got to build a couple of museums for this stuff that you don't have the money for, and you go rattle on down the list, and you say to yourself, oh my God, why are we doing this, right? Why are they doing that? What should they do? When do you stop? Those are my questions. I'm done.
From an archaeological point of view, it's the most important harbor that has ever been found in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
I mean, in other places, I would say, well, I'm not sure. But in this case, it's extraordinary. So
but it puts the issue squarely on the table. When do you stop? How much should we pay for archaeology? How much archaeology should we get? Should we really? I mean, Shadwell Hall told me yesterday, he was there after I was, and by the time he was there, they were reburying the 88,000 crates of pots on the other side of the dock. I mean, you've gone through this enormous trouble to collect all this stuff, and they simply can't process it. The carry-through costs of these boats is phenomenal. Yes, there's more than anyone's ever found. Are there too many? It's an interesting question for museums. Do we need all the stuff that's in museums? We did an exhibit at the Penn Museum a few years ago of Chinese mummies. We did it in conjunction with the Huntington Museum in California, and when they negotiated the contract with the Chinese, they screwed up. And as the mummies arrived at Penn, the Chinese said, well, actually, they're due back in China. And we said, well, wait a minute, we got this whole exhibit thing set up. They wouldn't let us open the crates for a month while we argued over this. We have some very talented folks at the Penn Museum who are very good among them, because we have lots of mummies. We have a guy whose hobby is making mummies. So he made copies of all the mummies. So we ran the exhibit for a month with fake mummies, photographs of the stuff we couldn't get out of the cases, and put up the whole rest of the exhibit with essentially a completely fake core holding. And nobody cared. People came, they enjoyed it. We told them what it was. We said, you know, this isn't the real thing. And astonishingly, nobody cared. And so you begin to ask yourself, well, do I really need all this stuff? Do I really need to spend all this money on conserving and preserving artifacts? You know, how many do I need? How many Maya pots do I really need, and which ones? When you're running a museum and your costs are going up, and someone says, I need a $10 million building just to put, you know, air conditioning in to hold all the pots that nobody's looked at in the last 20 years, you start to wrestle with questions like that. That's economics.